A fat maid slept with the CEO and ran. But the next day, 50 black cars rolled into her tiny town. No one knows why they've come or who they're looking for, until a baby's cry echoes from a small apartment above a bakery. The woman everyone overlooked is suddenly the center of a storm. He's not here for revenge. He's here for something even more shocking. The truth she's been hiding for almost a year. As cameras flash and whispers spread, why did she run from the man who would give up an empire to find her? And when he finally stands face to face with the woman who vanished with his heart, will forgiveness come too late, or rewrite both their lives forever? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The pre-dawn silence wrapped around Tamika Grant like a familiar shawl as she made her way through the dimly lit halls of the Cross Mansion. Her sensible shoes whispered against the marble floors, each step measured and purposeful. At 5:30 in the morning, the grand house felt less intimidating, more like an old church waiting for its congregation. In the formal dining room, Tamika pulled out the family silver from the heavy wooden cabinet, laying each piece carefully on the polishing cloth spread across the massive table. The weight of tradition and wealth resided in every fork and spoon. Her reflection, distorted in a silver serving bowl, showed a woman with kind eyes and full features, her hair neatly wrapped in a patterned scarf. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound! She hummed softly, working the polishing cloth in small circles. The familiar hymn filled the empty space around her, a quiet comfort in the grey light filtering through tall windows. Thunder rumbled in the distance, promising rain later in the day. 2 floors above, in his private study, Jason Cross sat motionless in his leather chair. The photograph in his hands caught the weak light. Sarah's smile frozen in time, her eyes bright with life at their last Christmas together. His thumb traced the edge of the frame, a gesture worn smooth by repetition. The house felt especially empty this morning. 18 months since Sarah's passing, and still the silence echoed. Jason's tailored suit couldn't hide the slight slope of his shoulders, the weight of grief still pressing down. The first streaks of dawn painted the sky outside his window in watercolor grays and pale pink, but he barely noticed. A soft chime from his phone reminded him of the early meeting waiting at the office. Jason placed the photograph back on his desk with careful precision, adjusting it to the exact angle where Sarah's smile seemed to fill the room. The kitchen, with its professional-grade appliances and marble countertops, served as neutral ground between upstairs and downstairs. Tamika had just finished with the silver when the need for coffee drew her there. Their smart coffee maker, all chrome and digital displays, blinked an angry red error message. "Oh, come on now," Tamika muttered, pressing buttons with growing frustration. "Don't be difficult today. It's been temperamental lately." Jason's voice came from the doorway, making her start slightly. "Mr. Cross, I'm sorry I didn't hear you come in." Tamika stepped back from the machine, smoothing her hands down her navy uniform dress. Jason moved into the kitchen, his presence filling the space in a way that made it seem smaller. "No need to apologize. I've been meaning to say something else, actually." He paused, one hand resting on the counter. "About last night, I shouldn't have spoken to you that way about the dining room arrangement. It was uncalled for." The memory of his sharp words about the place settings made Tamika's cheeks warm, but she shook her head. "It's forgotten, Mr. Cross. Sometimes days are just hard." The understanding in her voice carried no judgment, only compassion. "Still," he insisted, "it wasn't right." His fingers drummed once on the counter before he turned to the coffee maker. "May I?" "Please." Tamika gestured to the machine. "It's speaking in riddles this morning." Jason studied the display for a moment, then pressed a combination of buttons. Nothing happened. He tried again, and the machine responded with an irritated beep. A small smile tugged at Tamika's lips. "Looks like it's not playing favorites." The unexpected comment caught Jason off guard. He looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. There was something genuine in her face, a warmth that reminded him of summer afternoons. "I suppose not," he replied, and felt his own lips curve upward slightly. The smile felt foreign, like a language he'd forgotten how to speak. But it was there, brief and real. "Well," Tamika said, reaching for the French press on a high shelf. "Sometimes the old ways are best." She had to stretch to reach it, and Jason automatically moved to help, their hands briefly meeting on the glass container. "Thank you," she said softly, setting it on the counter. "Would you like a cup, Mr. Cross? It'll take a few minutes longer, but it'll be worth the wait." Jason checked his watch, then nodded. "Yes, thank you. I'd like that." They worked in comfortable silence, Tamika grinding the beans while Jason filled the kettle. The rich scent of coffee soon filled the kitchen, pushing back the shadows of early morning. Outside, the storm clouds gathered, painting the sky in deeper shades of grey. When Tamika poured the coffee into 2 mugs, one simple white ceramic, the other an elegant designer piece, the moment felt almost normal. Like they were just 2 people sharing coffee on a quiet morning, instead of employer and employee, instead of 2 souls carrying their separate burdens. "This is excellent," Jason said after his first sip, surprise evident in his voice. "My grandmother's method." Tamika explained. She always said, "Patience makes the best coffee." She cradled her own mug, letting the warmth seep into her hands. They stood there, the billionaire CEO and his housekeeper, drinking coffee as the storm approached. When Jason finally left for his office, the smile he'd shared lingered in Tamika's mind, like a photograph slightly out of focus but worth keeping. The day passed in its usual rhythm of tasks and quiet moments. By evening, the promised storm had arrived in full force, rain lashing against windows and wind howling through the gardens. Tamika finished her duties in the library, dusting shelves of leather-bound books that probably hadn't been opened in years. In his study, Jason stared at his laptop screen without really seeing it. The house creaked and sighed around him, and for a moment he could almost imagine Sarah's laugh echoing down the hallway. But it was just the wind, playing tricks with memory. Tamika gathered her things in the staff room, listening to the storm rage outside. Her small apartment would be dark and empty, her daughter away at college now. The thought of the quiet spaces waiting for her made her chest tight. As they each prepared to face their solitary evenings, the storm wrapped around the mansion like a dark blanket, emphasizing the emptiness of their separate worlds. Yet something had shifted that morning over French-pressed coffee, a tiny crack in the walls they'd built around their hearts, letting in just enough light to remember what warmth felt like. The thunder rolled overhead, nature's percussion accompanying Tamika's hymn, which still echoed faintly in the polished silver and through the quiet halls. In his study, Jason touched the photograph of Sarah one last time before turning off his desk lamp, carrying the memory of an unexpected smile into the gathering night. The storm intensified as night fell, transforming from steady rain to savage winds that whipped through the trees surrounding the mansion. Lightning split the sky in brilliant flashes, followed by thunderclaps that shook the windows in their frames. Tamika was finishing her evening duties when the lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged the entire mansion into darkness. She froze in place, her hands still holding the duster she'd been using on the hallway tables. "Mrs. Grant?" Jason's voice called from somewhere nearby, followed by the beam of a flashlight. "Are you all right?" "Yes, Mr. Cross," she answered, turning toward his voice. "I'm fine. just surprised. Jason appeared around the corner, his usually pristine appearance slightly disheveled. The power's out across the whole neighborhood. The roads aren't safe. There's flooding reported on Main Street. He paused, running a hand through his hair. I insist you stay in the staff quarters tonight. I wouldn't feel right letting you drive in this weather. Tamika hesitated. The staff quarters were comfortable, more comfortable than her own apartment, if she was honest. But staying overnight at her employer's home felt like crossing an invisible line. I don't want to impose, she started. Please. Jason cut in. It's not an imposition, it's common sense. His voice softened. I'd never forgive myself if something happened to you on the drive home. The sincerity in his tone made her relent. Thank you, Mr. Cross. That's very kind. He handed her a flashlight from a nearby emergency kit. There are fresh linens in the quarters. Make yourself comfortable. With that, he turned and disappeared down the darkened hallway toward his study. Tamika made her way to the staff quarters, but sleep eluded her. The storm raged outside, and something else nagged at her mind, the lost look in Jason's eyes when he'd handed her the flashlight. After an hour of tossing and turning, she got up. Lord, guide my steps, she whispered, then headed towards the study. The door was partially open, warm lamplight from a battery-operated lantern spilling into the hallway. She knocked softly. Mr. Cross? No answer came, but she could hear movement inside. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. Jason sat in his leather chair, tie loosened, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the desk beside him. In his hands, he held the photograph she'd seen him looking at before. His late wife, she assumed. His eyes were red-rimmed. Mrs. Grant. He acknowledged without looking up. You should be resting. So should you, sir. A bitter laugh escaped him. Rest? I haven't truly rested since... He broke off, taking another drink straight from the bottle. Tamika stepped fully into the room. Since your wife passed? The words hung in the air between them. Lightning flashed outside, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder that made Tamika jump. She stumbled forward, losing her balance. Jason moved with surprising quickness despite the alcohol, catching her before she fell. His hands were warm on her arms, steady despite everything. I've got you, he murmured. They stood frozen for a moment, too close in the lantern's glow. Tamika could smell the whiskey on his breath, but also something else, expensive cologne, and underneath that, grief so deep it seemed to have its own scent. She was everything, Jason whispered, still holding Tamika's arms. Everything. And God took her away. Just took her. What kind of loving God does that? The pain in his voice broke Tamika's heart. Without thinking, she placed a hand on his chest. He never leaves us, Mr. Cross. Even when we can't feel him, he's there. Then where was he when she was suffering? Where was he when I begged him to save her? Jason's voice cracked. Where is he now? Right here, Tamika said softly. In this room. In the storm. In the pain itself. She met his gaze. Sometimes his presence feels like absence because we're hurting too much to recognize it. Jason stared at her, something shifting in his eyes. His hands tightened slightly on her arms, then relaxed. How do you know? He whispered. Because I've been there too. Different pain. Same God. The silence between them trembled with unspoken understanding. Another flash of lightning illuminated the study, throwing their shadows against the wall. Two lonely souls standing too close, holding on to each other in the storm. Neither could say later who moved first. Perhaps they moved together, drawn by gravity and grief, and the strange intimacy of shared pain. His lips found hers, gentle at first, then desperate. Her hands clutched his shirt as his arms wrapped around her waist. They came together like two pieces of a broken thing trying to make themselves whole. His kisses tasted of whiskey and salt. Tears, she realized, though whether they were his or hers, she couldn't tell. His hands shook as they traced her face, her neck, her curves, touching her like she was precious, like she was beautiful. The storm raged on outside as they lost themselves in each other, finding solace in skin and breath and heartbeat. For a few hours, they weren't employer and employee, weren't widow and single mother. They were just two people holding back the darkness together. But as the first grey light of dawn crept through the study windows, reality crashed over Tamika like a cold wave. What had they done? What had she done? She looked at Jason, sleeping on the leather couch where they'd eventually ended up. His face was peaceful for the first time since she'd known him. Her heart ached with tenderness and shame in equal measure. Moving carefully so as not to wake him, she gathered her scattered clothes. Tears burned her eyes as she dressed quickly in the dim light. This couldn't happen again. Shouldn't have happened at all. She scribbled a note, just 2 words. "I'm sorry," and left it on the desk beside the now empty whiskey bottle. The storm had passed, leaving puddles that reflected the lightening sky. Tamika's hands trembled as she packed her few belongings from the staff quarters. She walked to her car through the wet grass, each step heavy with regret and something else she refused to name. As she drove away, the mansion grew smaller in her rearview mirror. Fresh rain began to fall, as if the sky itself was weeping for what she was leaving behind. The bus rolled into Maple Hollow just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in gentle pinks and purples. Tamika pressed her forehead against the cool window, watching as they passed the town's welcome sign with its cheerful slogan, "Where sweet memories begin. Population 2048. The smallness of the town wrapped around her like a warm blanket. Main Street consisted of just 3 blocks of brick buildings, their storefronts decorated with window boxes full of red geraniums. A white church steeple rose above the maple trees that gave the town its name, its bell tower catching the last rays of sunlight. Mrs. Chen, the owner of Sweet Dreams Bakery, met Tamika at the bus stop. The elderly woman's kind smile put her at ease immediately. "Second-floor apartment's all yours, dear," Mrs. Chen said, leading her up the narrow staircase that smelled of fresh bread and cinnamon. "It's not much, but it's clean." The apartment was tiny, just 1 room with a kitchenette and a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in. But the window overlooked the town square, and afternoon light streamed through white lace curtains. It felt safe. It felt like somewhere she could hide. Days blurred together as Tamika settled into her new routine. Up at 5 in the morning to clean offices in the small business district. Home by 2 to change for her waitressing shift at the Maple Diner. The work was exhausting, but she welcomed it. Physical tiredness was better than lying awake remembering that night in Jason's study. It was during her 3rd week in Maple Hollow that the morning sickness started. At first, she blamed it on stress and too little sleep. But when the nausea persisted and her uniform grew tight around the waist, she couldn't deny it anymore. The pregnancy test she bought from Johnson's pharmacy confirmed what her heart already knew. Tamika sat on the edge of her bathtub, staring at the little pink plus sign until her vision blurred with tears. A baby. Jason's baby. Their one night together had created a miracle she never expected. Fear gripped her chest. How could she raise a child alone? What would people think? But beneath the fear, a tiny spark of joy flickered to life. A baby, her baby. The following Sunday, she found herself in the back pew of Maple Hollow First Baptist Church. The congregation was small but welcoming, and no one pressed her when she kept to herself. After the service, an elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes approached her. "I'm Louise Matthews," she said, sitting down beside Tamika. But everyone just calls me Mrs. Louise. You're new here." Something in the woman's gentle manner made Tamika's carefully constructed walls crumble. Before she knew it, she was crying, telling Mrs. Louise everything. Well, almost everything. She left out Jason's name and wealth, just saying she'd made a mistake with her employer. "Child," Mrs. Louise said, taking Tamika's hands in her weathered ones. "That baby is no mistake. That baby is a gift from God." "But I'm not married," Tamika whispered. "People will talk." Mrs. Louise laughed softly. "Let them talk. God's greatest gifts often come in unexpected packages." Over the following months, Mrs. Louise became Tamika's strongest supporter. She accompanied her to prenatal appointments, helped her find second-hand baby furniture, and spent afternoons teaching her to knit tiny booties and sweaters. "My Henry's been gone 15 years now," Mrs. Louise said one day as they sorted through donated baby clothes. "But he always said every child brings their own love into the world. Your little one's already bringing love. See how it's gathering people around you." The church ladies had indeed rallied around Tamika. They brought her casseroles and baby supplies, offered rides to appointments, and never once made her feel judged. In quiet moments alone in her apartment, Tamika would sit in the second-hand rocking chair by the window, one hand resting on her growing belly. She sang the hymns her grandmother had sung to her, her voice soft in the gathering dusk. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The word caught in her throat the first time she felt the baby move. Grace. The name came to her like a whisper from heaven itself. "Grace," she murmured, rubbing her belly. "That's your name, little one. Grace Grant." Sometimes, usually late at night when she couldn't sleep, Tamika would think about Jason. She imagined telling him about the baby, their baby. But then she'd remember the pain in his eyes when he spoke of his late wife, the way grief had hollowed him out. How could she add more complexity to his life? No, it was better this way. Grace would be her blessing to carry alone. She sewed baby clothes from soft flannel she found on sale, making tiny dresses and onesies in peaceful shades of yellow and green. Each stitch was a prayer, each finished garment an act of love. "The Lord provides," Mrs. Louise would say whenever Tamika worried about money. And somehow he did. Extra shifts at the diner. A neighbor with a crib her grandchildren had outgrown. A church member who knew someone looking for a weekend housekeeping job. Maple Hollow wrapped its arms around her, becoming the home she never knew she needed. The bakery smells wafting up through her floorboards, the church bells marking the hours, the friendly waves from shopkeepers who knew her name. It all felt like grace itself. One evening, as she waddled home from her shift at the diner, Tamika caught her reflection in a storefront window. Her work uniform was stretched tight over her 7-month belly, her face tired but glowing. She looked different from the woman who had fled Jason's mansion in the rain. Stronger, more peaceful. "You're blooming," Mrs. Louise had told her that morning at church. "Like those surprise lilies that pop up in gardens where you least expect them. God plants beauty in the most unexpected places." Back in her apartment, Tamika folded tiny clothes and arranged them in the second-hand dresser. She touched each piece lovingly. The yellow sundress made from an old pillowcase, the white sweater Mrs. Louise had knitted, the soft blanket the church quilting circle had made. "Your life might not have started the way most people would approve of," she whispered to her unborn daughter, "but you are so loved, Grace, so very loved." The baby kicked in response, making Tamika smile through her tears. Yes, this was right. This was where they belonged. In this small town with its big heart, where grace flowed as steady and sweet as the maple sap in springtime. She would give Grace everything she could: love, security, faith. And if sometimes, late at night, she dreamed of gray eyes and gentle hands. Well, that would be her secret to keep. Her daughter deserved a peaceful life, and so did Jason. This was her gift to them both, silence born of love. The early morning sunlight painted golden stripes across Tamika's bedroom floor as she knelt beside her bed, hands clasped in prayer. This had become her daily ritual, thanking God for another peaceful day ahead, for the miracle of grace, for the kindness of her new community. Amen, she whispered, just as Grace began to stir in her crib. Good morning, sunshine, Tamika cooed, lifting her daughter. Grace's grey eyes, so much like Jason's, blinked sleepily before breaking into a gummy smile. At 10 months old, she was a happy baby, full of giggles and reaching hands. Tamika went through their morning routine with practiced ease. Diaper change, warm bottle, soft songs while Grace nursed. She dressed her daughter in a pale yellow romper that Mrs. Louise had sewn, carefully combing the dark curls that were starting to spring from Grace's head. Ready for our walk, sweet pea? Tamika secured Grace in her second-hand stroller, tucking a light blanket around her legs, though the spring morning was mild. These morning walks had become sacred time, just mother and daughter greeting the day together. The streets of Maple Hollow were quiet at this hour. A few early risers nodded hello as they collected their newspapers or watered their flower boxes. The smell of fresh bread from Henson's bakery drifted down Main Street, making Tamika's stomach rumble. Mr. Henson was already at his counter when she pushed the stroller through the door, bell jingling overhead. His weathered face creased into a grandfatherly smile at the sight of Grace. There's my favorite customer. He came around the counter, hands already reaching for the baby. May I? Tamika nodded, smiling as she lifted Grace into his flour-dusted arms. The old baker had become like family over the past year, watching out for them both with quiet kindness. Someone's getting bigger every day, he said, bouncing Grace gently. The baby grabbed at his white mustache, making him chuckle. Just like her mama, sweet as can be. He handed Grace back and disappeared into the kitchen, returning with a paper bag. Fresh sourdough, still warm, and a couple of those orange cranberry muffins you like. Mr. Henson, you don't have to— Hush now. Can't have my girls going hungry. He waved away her attempt to pay. Besides, this little angel brings more joy to my shop than any money could buy. Tamika's eyes misted as she accepted the bag. This was why she loved Maple Hollow. These small kindnesses freely given, this sense of belonging she'd never known before. She had just settled Grace back in her stroller when she noticed a change in the street outside. People were gathering at windows, pointing and whispering. A low rumble of engines drew closer. 3 black SUVs rolled down Main Street, their tinted windows reflecting the morning sun. They moved slowly, purposefully, like searching predators. Tamika's heart stuttered in her chest. She knew those vehicles. They were from Cross Enterprises' executive fleet. My word, Mr. Henson muttered, coming to stand beside her at the window. Don't often see fancy cars like that around here. The lead SUV pulled to a stop, directly in front of the bakery. Tamika's hands tightened on the stroller handle as the rear door opened. A polished black shoe emerged, followed by a familiar, tall figure in an expensive grey suit. Jason Cross looked thinner than she remembered, his face more lined. He stood for a moment on the sidewalk, running a hand through his silver-touched dark hair as he surveyed the street. Even after a year, the sight of him made her breath catch. Tamika. Mr. Henson's voice was gentle with concern. You've gone white as my flower, dear. Do you know that, gentleman? She couldn't answer. Grace chose that moment to let out a happy squeal, reaching for the crystal sun catcher that hung in the window. The sound drew Jason's attention. His head turned sharply toward the bakery. Their eyes met through the glass. Time seemed to stop. all the carefully constructed piece of the past year shattered in that single moment of recognition. Jason's face showed a flash of raw emotion before his businessman's mask slipped back into place. He started walking toward the bakery entrance. "Tamika?" Mr. Henson touched her arm. "Should I?" "It's all right," she managed to whisper, though her heart was racing. He's Grace's father." Understanding dawned in the old baker's eyes. Without a word, he moved to stand protectively near her as the bell above the door chimed. Jason's presence filled the small shop. His expensive cologne, the same one she remembered from that stormy night, mingled with the homey scent of fresh bread. He stopped just inside the door, his gaze moving from Tamika to the baby in the stroller. Grace looked up at him curiously, grey eyes meeting their mirror image. A muscle jumped in Jason's jaw. "Tamika." His voice was hoarse, as if he'd been searching for a long time just to say her name. "I've been looking for you." The sound of his voice broke whatever spell had frozen her in place. Tamika's hands trembled as she gripped the stroller handle tighter, instinctively angling herself between Jason and Grace. How did you find me?" The words came out barely above a whisper. It wasn't easy. He took a step closer, stopping when she tensed. "You disappeared completely. No forwarding address, no phone number. I hired private investigators, but you'd covered your tracks well." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Until someone mentioned seeing you at a small-town bakery, serving the best sourdough bread in 3 counties. Mr. Henson made a small sound of pride at that, then quickly covered it with a cough. "I thought—" Tamika swallowed hard. "I thought it would be better this way, for everyone." "Better?" Something flashed in Jason's eyes. Hurt, anger, she couldn't tell. "You vanished without a word. I woke up alone, Tamika. I thought—" He ran a hand through his hair again, a gesture she remembered from when he was struggling to express himself. "I thought something had happened to you, that I'd somehow driven you away, hurt you somehow." "No," she said quickly. "No, you didn't hurt me, I just—" She glanced down at Grace, who was watching the exchange with solemn eyes. "Things got complicated." Jason's gaze followed hers to the baby. He took another step forward, slower this time. "She has my eyes," he said softly. Tamika nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "What's her name?" "Grace." The word came out on a shaky breath. "Grace Louise Grant. Grace." He repeated it like a prayer. May I see her, please?" The naked longing in his voice made Tamika's heart ache. She looked to Mr. Henson, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Would you—" She gestured to the small cafe table by the window. "Would you like to sit down?" Jason nodded, moving carefully as if afraid to startle them. He sank into one of the chairs, while Tamika settled Grace on her lap at the opposite side of the table. Mr. Henson quietly retreated to his kitchen, giving them privacy while staying within earshot. Grace studied Jason with frank curiosity, then broke into one of her heart-melting smiles. Jason's breath caught audibly. "She's beautiful," he whispered, "like her mother." Color rushed to Tamika's cheeks. "Jason, why didn't you tell me?" The question held no accusation, only a deep sadness. "Did you think I wouldn't want to know? That I wouldn't want to be part of her life?" "You were grieving," Tamika said softly. "You'd been through so much already. I didn't want to complicate your life further. So you decided to carry this alone?" He leaned forward, his voice intense. "Raise our daughter by yourself rather than trust me with the truth." "I trusted you with my heart that night," she answered, surprising herself with her honesty. "But in the morning, it all seemed like a dream. You're Jason Cross, billionaire CEO, grieving widower. I'm just me, a housekeeper who got above herself. I thought it would be easier. Easier for whom?" Jason interrupted. Not for you, struggling alone. Not for Grace, growing up without knowing her father. And certainly not for me, spending a year searching for the woman who'd brought light back into my life, only to discover I had a daughter too. Tears spilled down Tamika's cheeks. Grace patted her face with concern, making soft baby sounds of distress. I'm sorry, Tamika whispered. I thought I was doing the right thing. The right thing would have been letting me choose. Jason said quietly. Letting me be there for both of you. Before Tamika could respond, Grace reached across the table toward Jason, making grabbing motions with her tiny hands. Without thinking, Tamika rose and stepped around the table, gently, transferring their daughter into his arms. Jason cradled Grace with infinite tenderness, his eyes bright with unshed tears as she immediately grabbed his silk tie and stuffed it in her mouth. Hello, Grace, he murmured. I'm your daddy. The bell above the bakery door chimed as more townspeople filtered in, drawn by the sight of the luxury vehicles lining Main Street. Jason gently handed Grace back to Tamika, then stood up, straightening his tie. I need to make an announcement, he said quietly. You might want to take Grace upstairs. Tamika's heart began to race. Jason, please, trust me, he said softly. Just this once. Mr. Henson appeared at her elbow. Come on, dear. You can use my office stairs. They lead right up to your apartment. Clutching Grace close, Tamika followed the baker through the kitchen just as Jason stepped onto the bakery's small front porch. Through the window, she could see at least 50 people gathered, their faces curious and expectant. Good morning. Jason's voice carried clearly through the open windows. I'm Jason Cross, and I'm looking for someone very important to me. Tamika Grant. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Tamika froze on the stairs, her legs trembling. Tamika worked for me last year. Jason continued. She left suddenly, and I believe... His voice caught slightly. I believe she has my child. The whispers turned to gasps. Someone in the crowd pulled out a phone, starting to record. Keep going, Mr. Henson urged gently, guiding Tamika up the remaining stairs. You'll be safer up there. In her tiny apartment above the bakery, Tamika sank into the worn armchair by the window, holding Grace close. The baby sensed her distress, making small, whimpering sounds. Shh, sweet girl, Tamika whispered, rubbing Grace's back. It's okay. Mama's got you. Below, the crowd had grown. Tamika could see phones everywhere now, recording Jason as he stood on the porch. His voice drifted up clearly through her partially open window. I know this might seem like tabloid material, he was saying, but that's not why I'm here. I'm not interested in scandal or drama. I just want the truth. A sleek news van pulled up, and Tamika's stomach dropped. A reporter and cameraman jumped out, quickly setting up their equipment. Lord have mercy, she breathed, watching as more vehicles arrived. Within an hour, 3 more news crews had appeared, and the crowd had swelled to fill the entire street. Mr. Henson appeared at her door with a tray of tea and fresh scones. You doing okay up here? Tamika shook her head. I don't know what to do. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid. All this attention, all these cameras. That man down there, Mr. Henson said, setting the tray down. He's been nothing but gentle and respectful. Not at all what you'd expect from some big-shot CEO. He's always been different from what people expect. Tamika admitted softly. Grace had fallen asleep on her shoulder, one tiny hand curled around her collar. The afternoon light was fading when Tamika's phone buzzed, a text from Mrs. Louise. Turn on Channel 5, honey. With trembling fingers, Tamika reached for the remote. The local news was running a special report showing footage from earlier that day. There was Jason, looking tired but determined, speaking directly to the camera. If she's watching, Tamika, I forgive you. His voice filled her small living room. Please, just talk to me. Whatever you're afraid of, whatever made you run, we can work through it together. The camera cut to interviews with townspeople. Mr. Henson appeared, carefully saying nothing specific but praising Tamika's character. Mrs. Louise spoke about Grace being a blessing to our whole community. Tamika clicked off the TV, moving to stand by the window. The street below had finally cleared, though one black SUV remained parked across the street. Security, probably. Grace stirred against her shoulder, making soft baby sounds in her sleep. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled. Lord? Tamika's voice was barely a whisper, as tears slid down her cheeks. What do I do now? The morning sun cast long shadows across Tamika's tiny apartment as she knelt beside her bed, hands clasped in desperate prayer. Her heart felt like it might burst from her chest at any moment. A gentle knock at the door made her look up. Come in, she called softly, careful not to wake Grace, who was still sleeping peacefully in her crib. Mrs. Louise and Pastor Evans entered quietly, their faces full of compassion. Mrs. Louise immediately went to Tamika, wrapping her in a warm embrace that smelled of lavender and fresh-baked bread. We thought you might need some support this morning, Pastor Evans said, settling into the worn armchair by the window. His kind eyes studied her face. How are you holding up? Tamika sank onto the edge of her bed, twisting her hands in her lap. I'm scared, she admitted. Every time I think about facing him, my stomach ties itself in knots. Mrs. Louise sat beside her, taking one of Tamika's trembling hands in her weathered ones. Fear is natural, child, but remember what Scripture tells us about being strong and courageous. Joshua 1 verse 9. Pastor Evans added softly, Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Tamika closed her eyes, letting the familiar words wash over her. In her crib, Grace stirred and made a small, cooing sound. Look at that precious child, Mrs. Louise said, nodding toward the crib. She's a gift from God, Tamika. And that man downstairs? He deserves to know his daughter. But what if... Tamika's voice cracked. What if he tries to take her away? Pastor Evans leaned forward, his expression serious. Tamika, I've been watching Jason Cross since he arrived in town. That's not a man looking to cause harm. That's a man seeking reconciliation. Mrs. Louise squeezed Tamika's hand. You need to pray for courage, dear. The Lord didn't bring you this far to leave you now. Tamika looked between her two friends, drawing strength from their steady presence. After a moment, she nodded slowly and reached for her phone on the nightstand. Her fingers shook as she dialed the number for the Mountain View Hotel. Each ring seemed to last an eternity. Mountain View Hotel, how may I direct your call? Jason Cross's room, please. Tamika managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, Mr. Cross has asked not to be disturbed. May I take a message? Tamika took a deep breath, feeling Mrs. Louise's reassuring hand on her shoulder. Yes, please. Tell him it's me. I'll meet him tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock at Memorial Park. After hanging up, Tamika burst into tears. Mrs. Louise held her while she cried, rubbing gentle circles on her back like she used to do for Grace. That's it, let it all out, the older woman murmured. The first step is always the hardest. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with dew sparkling on the grass in Memorial Park. Tamika arrived early, pushing Grace's stroller along the quiet paths. Her daughter was dressed in her prettiest yellow sundress, dark curls topped with a tiny bow. From a distance, she could see Jason already waiting on a bench near the fountain. He looked different from yesterday, less like a CEO and more like a nervous father in jeans and a simple blue button-down shirt. Several news vans were parked at the far end of the park, their cameras trained on Jason from a respectful distance. Tamika's feet felt like lead as she approached. Jason stood when he saw her, his eyes immediately falling to the stroller. Time seemed to slow down, the morning air growing thick with tension. "Tamika," he breathed, and she could see tears forming in his grey eyes, the same eyes that Grace had inherited. She stopped a few feet away, her hands gripping the stroller handle so tight her knuckles turned white. "Jason." He took a tentative step forward, gaze fixed on Grace, who was contentedly playing with her stuffed rabbit. "Is she?" "Yes," Tamika whispered. "This is Grace." Jason reached out instinctively, then pulled back when he saw Tamika tense. "May I?" Tamika hesitated, her protective instincts warring with the truth she saw in his eyes. After what felt like forever, she nodded slowly. With trembling hands, Jason knelt beside the stroller. "Hi, Grace," he said softly, voice thick with emotion. "I'm your daddy." Grace looked up at him with curious eyes, then broke into a sunny smile that was pure Tamika. Jason's breath caught audibly. "She has my eyes," he whispered. "And your smile when she's being mischievous," Tamika added, without thinking. Jason looked up at her, and the weight of everything unsaid hung between them. "Will you sit with me, please?" Tamika nodded, settling onto the bench beside him, but keeping one hand on the stroller. For a long moment, neither spoke, watching as Grace played with her rabbit. "I looked everywhere for you," Jason finally said, his voice low and intense. "When I woke up that morning and found you gone, I thought I'd dreamed it all." "I was scared," Tamika admitted. "Scared of what people would say, scared of causing a scandal, scared of—" She swallowed hard. "Scared of how much that night meant to me." "It meant everything to me too," Jason said quietly. "That night, it was the first time since Sarah died that I felt alive again. You showed me such gentleness, such understanding." Tamika wiped at a tear sliding down her cheek. "I didn't want to be a burden to you. You were grieving, and I thought—" "You thought wrong," Jason interrupted gently. "I was lost in grief, yes, but you helped me find my way back to faith that night. When you told me God never abandons us, I needed to hear that more than you knew." Grace chose that moment to drop her rabbit. Before Tamika could move, Jason was already reaching for it. As he handed it back, Grace grabbed his finger, holding on tight and giggling. The simple sound seemed to melt years of pain from Jason's face. He looked at Tamika, eyes shining. "May I hold her, please?" This time, Tamika didn't hesitate. She lifted Grace from the stroller and carefully placed her in Jason's arms. The baby immediately reached for his face, patting his cheeks with tiny hands. "Hello, beautiful girl," Jason whispered, pressing a gentle kiss to Grace's forehead. "I've waited so long to meet you." They talked for hours, the morning slipping away as they shared their stories. Jason spoke about his frantic search for her, his private investigators coming up empty. Tamika described her months of mourning sickness, the kindness of the Maple Hollow community, the joy of Grace's birth. "I prayed for you both every night," Jason confessed as Grace dozed in his arms. "I didn't even know about her, but something in my heart knew I'd lost more than just you that morning." The sun was high overhead when Grace finally began to fuss, ready for her lunch. As Tamika prepared to leave, Jason touched her arm gently. "I want to be part of her life," he said. "Part of both your lives, if you'll let me. No pressure, no demands, just a chance to know my daughter. And maybe—" He paused, looking into her eyes. Maybe a chance to show you that you can trust me." Grace chose that moment to let out another delighted giggle, reaching for Jason's nose. The sound seemed to wrap around them both, melting away the last barriers of doubt and fear. The morning sun painted Maple Hollow's main street in warm, golden light as Jason walked into Mr. Henson's bakery. The bell above the door chimed softly, and the smell of fresh bread wrapped around him like a warm embrace. "The usual order for Tamika?" Mr. Henson asked with a knowing smile, already reaching for the paper bags. "And maybe something special for Grace," Jason added, his eyes crinkling at the corners. A week had passed since their first meeting in the park, and he'd quickly learned his daughter's fondness for Mr. Henson's sweet potato muffins. The small cottage he'd rented sat just 2 streets over from Tamika's apartment. It was nothing like his mansion back home, just a simple 2-bedroom house with creaky floorboards and faded wallpaper, but somehow it felt more like home than anywhere he'd been in the past year. Every morning started the same way. Breakfast delivery from the bakery, followed by helping Tamika with whatever errands she had planned for the day. Today, they needed to pick up Grace's prescription from the pharmacy and shop for groceries. When Jason arrived at Tamika's apartment above the bakery, she was already dressed and getting Grace ready for the day. The baby squealed with delight at the sight of him, reaching out with grabby hands. "Someone's happy to see their daddy," Tamika said softly, the words still new and tender between them. Jason took Grace into his arms, breathing in her baby powder scent. "Good morning, Princess," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her curly head. They walked to the pharmacy together, pushing Grace's stroller down the quiet streets. Several townspeople waved, already used to seeing them together. The initial shock of Jason Cross's presence had mellowed into acceptance, especially after seeing how tenderly he cared for Tamika and Grace. "The faucet in your kitchen is still dripping," Jason mentioned as they waited for the prescription. "I could fix that for you today." Tamika looked up at him, a slight smile playing at her lips. "You know how to fix faucets." "I wasn't always a CEO," he replied with a wink. "Some things you never forget." Later that afternoon, Jason sat cross-legged under Tamika's sink, tools spread out around him. Grace watched from her playpen, occasionally throwing her stuffed rabbit in his direction. "Hand me that wrench?" he asked Tamika, who knelt beside him with an amused expression. "This one? Perfect." Their fingers brushed as she passed it to him, sending a familiar warmth through his chest. The past week had been filled with moments like these, simple, domestic, precious. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm, learning to be comfortable around each other again. Sometimes, when Grace was napping, they'd sit on Tamika's small balcony and talk about everything and nothing. That evening, while Grace played with her blocks on the living room floor, Tamika stirred a pot of beef stew on the stove. The rich aroma filled the apartment, reminding Jason of comfort and home. "Sarah used to make stew like this," he said quietly, leaning against the counter. It was the first time he'd mentioned his late wife's name since that night during the storm. Tamika's hand stilled on the wooden spoon. "Tell me about her," she asked gently. Jason took a deep breath, his eyes distant. She was radiant, always smiling, always finding the good in everything. Even when she got sick, she never lost that light. His voice cracked slightly. The cancer took her so fast. One day she was planning our vacation to Italy, and the next, I couldn't save her. All my money, all my connections, none of it mattered. Tamika reached out, touching his arm softly. "It wasn't your fault, Jason. I know that now," he whispered, "but for a long time I was so angry, at God, at myself, at the whole world. Losing her nearly destroyed me. I threw myself into work, stopped going to church, pushed everyone away." He looked at Grace, who was happily stacking blocks. "Until that night with you," You reminded me that Grace still exists, that love isn't finished with me yet. The moment was shattered by sudden shouts from outside. Through the kitchen window, they saw several men with cameras jumping over the small fence into the cottage's yard. There she is, the gold digger who trapped Jason Cross. Hey, sweetheart, show us the $1 million baby. Flashbulbs exploded through the windows as the paparazzi pressed closer, their cruel words cutting through the evening air. Tamika instinctively ran to Grace, scooping her up as the baby began to cry. Jason was already on his phone, his voice sharp with anger. Security breach at the cottage. Get here now. He turned to Tamika, who stood trembling with Grace clutched to her chest. Stay away from the windows. Within minutes, Jason's security team arrived, their black SUVs screeching to a halt outside. The paparazzi scattered like rats, but not before getting their shots. Tamika's frightened face, Grace crying, Jason's protective stance in front of them. When the chaos subsided, Tamika sat on the couch, still shaking. Grace had calmed down and was now sleeping against her shoulder, but Tamika's eyes were wide with fear. I can't do this to her, she whispered. I won't let them turn her life into a circus. Jason knelt in front of her, taking her free hand in his. Listen to me, Tamika. What happened tonight? It ends now. I promise you no one will ever humiliate you or Grace again. His voice was steel and velvet at once. I've already contacted my lawyers. We'll get restraining orders, increase security, whatever it takes. You and Grace are my family now, and I protect my family. Tamika looked into his eyes, seeing the same determination she'd glimpsed that first morning in his kitchen, when he'd apologized for snapping at her. But now there was something more, a fierce tenderness that made her heart skip. I'm sorry, he continued softly. I should have anticipated this, should have had better security in place. But I promise you, things will be different from now on. Grace stirred in her sleep, making little snuffling sounds that drew both their gazes. In the quiet aftermath of the chaos, they watched their daughter sleep, united in their desire to protect her from the harsh realities of their complicated world. A week of relative peace followed the paparazzi incident. The morning sun painted Maple Hollow in gentle strokes of gold, and life seemed to settle into a sweet rhythm. Jason had kept his promise. Additional security measures meant no more unwanted visitors, and Tamika felt safe again in her little apartment above the bakery. That Thursday morning started like any other. Tamika was warming Grace's bottle while Jason sat at her small kitchen table, scrolling through emails on his phone. The coffee maker hummed softly, filling the air with its rich aroma. Everything felt normal, peaceful even, until Jason's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Jessica, he answered, recognizing his assistant's number. What's wrong? Tamika turned from the counter, catching the sudden tension in his voice. She watched as the color drained from his face. When did this happen? Jason's knuckles whitened around the phone. No, that's impossible. I signed off on every transaction myself. He stood up, pacing the small kitchen. How much are we talking about? Grace babbled from her high chair, reaching for her bottle, but both adults were frozen in the gravity of the moment. Get Martin to pull all the records from the past 5 years. Yes, everything. Jason's voice had taken on that commanding tone Tamika remembered from his mansion. I'll be there as soon as I can. When he ended the call, the silence in the kitchen felt heavy enough to touch. Jason braced himself against the counter, his shoulders rigid with stress. What is it? Tamika asked softly, touching his arm. Robert Chen, my chief financial officer. Jason's voice was hollow. He's been embezzling funds from the company for years. We're talking millions of dollars, maybe more. The FBI is involved now. Tamika's hand flew to her mouth. Oh, Jason. The board is calling an emergency meeting. He hesitated, turning to face her. They're demanding I return to the city immediately. Jessica says there are already reporters camping outside the corporate office. Before Tamika could respond, Jason's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message from the chairman of the board. As he read it, his jaw clenched. "They want me to distance myself from you and Grace," he said quietly, "to preserve the company's image during this crisis. They're worried about how it would look. Me hiding out in a small town with—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "With your former housekeeper and illegitimate child?" Tamika completed it for him, her voice steady despite the pain those words caused. Jason reached for her hand. "You know that's not how I see you. But that's how they see us," she said simply. "How the world sees us." They spent the day in a strange limbo, trying to maintain normalcy for Grace's sake, while Jason fielded endless calls from his lawyers and board members. By evening, the gravity of the situation had become clear. The company Jason had built from the ground up was in serious trouble. That night, after Grace was asleep, they sat at Tamika's small kitchen table. A half-empty cup of tea sat cold between them. Outside, crickets chirped in the darkness, oblivious to the human drama unfolding inside. "I might lose everything," Jason finally said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "The company, my reputation, everything I've worked for my entire life." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration Tamika had come to know well. "The board wants me to call a press conference tomorrow, deny any knowledge of the embezzlement, and announce my temporary step back from the company." "And what about us?" Tamika asked quietly. "They want me to—" He struggled with the words. "To make it clear that my relationship with you was a brief indiscretion during a period of grief, and that I'm focused now on saving the company." Tamika absorbed this, her hands folded carefully in her lap. The old familiar feeling of being less than tried to creep in, but she pushed it away. God hadn't brought her this far to let shame win now. "What do you want to do?" she asked. Jason stood up, walking to the window. The streetlights cast long shadows across his face. "I've spent 20 years building this company. It employs thousands of people. If it falls apart because of this, then don't lose your soul trying to keep it." The words came out of Tamika's mouth with quiet certainty. Jason turned to look at her, surprised by the strength in her voice. "What?" "You heard me," she said, standing up. "I know what it's like to lose everything, Jason, to start over with nothing but faith and hope. It's scary, but it's not the end. What matters is who you are when the storm passes." He crossed the room to her, taking her hands in his. "How did you get so wise?" "Learning things the hard way." She smiled softly. "Besides, you haven't lost everything. You have Grace. You have—" She hesitated. "You have me." They stood there in the quiet kitchen, holding on to each other as the weight of decisions yet to be made hung in the air between them. The next morning dawned grey and cool. Jason's bag was packed and waiting by the door. He'd spent an hour just holding Grace, memorizing the feel of her tiny hands and the sweet baby smell of her hair. "I'll come back as soon as I can," he promised, standing in Tamika's doorway. "Once I get this sorted out." "I know," Tamika said, bouncing Grace gently in her arms. "Do what you need to do. We'll be here." Jason leaned down to kiss Grace's forehead. Then, after a moment's hesitation, pressed a gentle kiss to Tamika's cheek. "Thank you," he whispered, "for reminding me what really matters." Tamika stood at her window, watching as Jason's black SUV pulled away from the curb. Grace waved her little hand, not understanding why her daddy was leaving. As the car disappeared down the rural road, taking Jason back to his world of skyscrapers and boardrooms, Tamika felt her heart ache with a familiar mix of loss and pride. "It's okay, sweet girl," she whispered to Grace, though perhaps she was really talking to herself. Sometimes loving someone means being brave enough to let them face their battles alone. She turned away from the window, holding her daughter close. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting patterns on the floor that reminded her of stained glass windows in church. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, its clear tone carrying across the quiet town, marking another beginning, another chance for Grace to work its quiet miracle in their lives. The days after Jason's departure melted together like watercolors in the rain. Tamika threw herself into her routines, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of work and motherhood. Each morning, she'd wake before dawn to feed Grace, then bundle her up for the walk to Mrs. Louise's house, where the elderly widow had insisted on watching the baby while Tamika worked. "You're too thin, child," Mrs. Louise would say, pressing containers of homemade soup into Tamika's hands. "You need to keep your strength up." But food had lost its taste lately. The cruel headlines splashed across newspapers and gossip sites had stolen her appetite. Walking through town became an exercise in keeping her head high, while whispers followed her like shadows. "Billionaire's baby mama drama," screamed one tabloid headline at the grocery store checkout. "Maid traps tycoon, the gold digger's guide to catching a CEO," proclaimed another. Tamika's hands shook as she quickly turned the magazines around, protecting Grace from seeing her mother's face plastered across the covers like some kind of criminal. The baby gurgled happily in her carrier, unaware of the storm surrounding their little family. At night, after putting Grace to bed, Tamika would sit by her window and pray. Sometimes she'd hold her phone, thumb hovering over Jason's number, but she never called. He needed space to fight his battles. Still, loneliness crept in during these quiet moments, wrapping around her like a heavy blanket. The autumn days grew shorter, and leaves began to turn golden on the trees lining Maple Hollow's main street. Tamika had just finished feeding Grace her afternoon bottle when a knock at the door startled them both. There stood Jason, but not the polished CEO she remembered. His suit was rumpled, tie loose around his neck, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. He looked like a man who'd been through war. "Jason." Tamika's heart clenched at his appearance. "What happened?" He stepped inside, his movements heavy with exhaustion. "They voted me out," he said simply. "The board held an emergency meeting this morning." Tamika quickly closed the door, shutting out the world that had wounded him so deeply. Without a word, she guided him to her small couch, where Grace lay on her playmat, kicking her feet at a dangling mobile. The sight of his daughter brought the first real emotion to Jason's face. He reached down to touch her cheek, and Grace caught his finger, squeezing it with her tiny fist. Something in his expression crumbled. "Let me make you some tea," Tamika said softly, already moving towards the kitchen. She needed to do something, anything, to help. "They wanted me to hold a press conference," Jason called after her, his voice hollow. "They had it all scripted out. I was supposed to say our night together was a mistake, that I was grieving and vulnerable, that you took advantage." The kettle Tamika was filling clattered against the sink. She set it down carefully, trying to steady her trembling hands. "But I couldn't do it," he continued. "I looked at that statement they wanted me to read, and all I could think about was Grace. About you. About how much peace I've found here in this little town, more than I ever had in that glass tower." Tamika returned with 2 steaming mugs, setting them on the coffee table. She sat beside him, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to overwhelm. "So I resigned," he said simply, "before they could fire me. I stood up in that boardroom and told them they could take the company, but they couldn't take my peace." He turned to look at her, his grey eyes intense. "I won't let them destroy what matters most." Tamika's throat tightened with emotion. She reached out and took his hand, her darker fingers intertwining with his pale ones. They sat in silence, watching Grace play, listening to her happy babbles. "You can stay here tonight," Tamika said after a while. "The couch isn't much, but it's perfect." Jason interrupted, squeezing her hand. "Everything here is perfect." As evening settled over Maple Hollow, they shared a simple dinner of leftover chicken soup and fresh bread from the bakery downstairs. Jason told her everything about the investigation revealing deeper corruption than anyone had suspected, about board members who'd turned against him, about reporters camping outside his mansion. "I don't even care anymore," he admitted, helping her clear the dishes. "It's like losing the company lifted a weight I didn't know I was carrying." Later, after Grace was tucked into her crib, Tamika brought Jason a pillow and blanket for the couch. He'd shed his suit jacket and tie, rolled up his sleeves. In the soft lamplight, he looked younger, more vulnerable. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving me a safe place to land." Tamika smiled, smoothing the blanket over the couch arm. "That's what family does," she replied, then blushed at her own boldness. But Jason just smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him all day. He settled onto the couch, and Tamika turned out the main lights, leaving just a small lamp glowing. Through the thin walls, they could hear Grace's soft breathing from her crib in the next room. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, Jason's face relaxed completely. The worried lines on his forehead smoothed out, and his breathing became deep and regular. In the peaceful quiet of Tamika's modest apartment, surrounded by the simple evidence of family life, Grace's toys scattered on the floor, baby bottles drying on the dish rack, a half-finished blanket Tamika was knitting, he finally found rest. Tamika watched from her bedroom doorway for a moment, her heart full of emotions she couldn't quite name. Then she quietly closed her door, leaving it cracked just enough to hear if Grace needed her in the night. Through her window, she could see the stars twinkling over Maple Hollow, brighter than they ever shone in the city. A cool breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed. A lonely sound, but tonight it didn't feel lonely at all. Dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and purples as Tamika woke to the sounds of Grace's morning babbles through the baby monitor. She stretched, ready to start her usual routine, when she heard Jason's gentle voice. "Hey there, little sunshine. Are you hungry?" Tamika smiled, listening to him talking softly to Grace. After everything he'd lost yesterday, his voice still held such tenderness. She lay there for a moment, savoring the peaceful morning sounds of bottles clinking and Grace's happy coos. Then came a crash that made her heart stop. "Jason!" Tamika called out, jumping from her bed. No answer. Just Grace's startled cry. She rushed into the kitchen and found Jason crumpled on the floor, the baby bottle rolling away from his outstretched hand. Grace sat in her high chair, crying and reaching for her father. "Jason!" Tamika dropped to her knees beside him. His face was ashen, skin clammy. "Jason, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered but didn't focus. His breathing came in short, irregular gasps. With trembling hands, Tamika grabbed her phone and dialed 911. "I need an ambulance," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "A man collapsed. He's 42 years old. Yes, he's breathing, but it's not right." The operator's calm voice guided her through, checking his pulse and positioning him on his side. Every second stretched like an hour. Tamika kept one hand on Jason's shoulder while reaching up to comfort Grace. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, though tears streamed down her face. "Daddy's going to be okay. Lord, please let him be okay." Memories flooded her mind unbidden. That stormy night when they'd first crossed the line between employer and employee, the warmth of his arms, the gentleness in his touch, the months of silence that followed, heavy with unspoken words and hidden truths. She'd run away then, thinking she was protecting him. Now he lay unconscious on her kitchen floor, and she'd never felt more helpless. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Mrs. Louise appeared in the doorway, still in her robe and slippers. "I heard the commotion," she said, immediately taking charge of Grace. "Go with him, dear. We'll look after the baby." The paramedics worked efficiently, checking vital signs and hooking up monitors. Their technical terms blurred together in Tamika's ears, something about arrhythmia and blood pressure. They loaded Jason onto a stretcher, his normally commanding presence diminished against the stark white sheets. In the ambulance, Tamika held his hand, noticing how cold his fingers felt. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm not running away this time." The emergency room was a chaos of beeping machines and rushing medical staff. They whisked Jason away for tests, leaving Tamika alone in the waiting room. She sank into an uncomfortable plastic chair, her mother's old Bible clutched to her chest like a shield. Hours crawled by. Tamika alternated between pacing and praying, her thoughts spinning between past and present. She remembered the first time she'd seen Jason in his study, staring at his late wife's photo with such raw grief. The way he'd apologized for snapping at her, showing the kindness beneath his pain. The tender way he held Grace when they reunited in the park. "Mrs. Grant?" A doctor in wrinkled scrubs approached. "I'm Dr. Chen. We've stabilized Mr. Cross, but the tests confirm he's experiencing stress-induced heart failure." The words hit her like physical blows. Heart failure. But he's so young. Chronic stress, especially emotional trauma, can severely impact cardiac health. Dr. Chen explained gently. The recent business crisis, combined with previous grief and likely years of overwork, has taken its toll. He needs complete rest and careful monitoring. Tamika nodded numbly, guilt crushing her chest. If she hadn't disappeared that morning after their night together, if she'd been honest about Grace from the beginning, maybe the stress wouldn't have built up so severely. "Can I see him?" Dr. Chen led her to a private room where machines tracked Jason's heartbeat in steady green lines. He looked vulnerable in the hospital gown, his face still too pale against the white pillows. Tamika took her place beside his bed, claiming his hand between both of hers. His fingers twitched slightly at her touch, but his eyes remained closed. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears falling freely now. "I thought I was protecting you by staying away, but I was wrong. I was just scared. Scared of my feelings, scared of what people would think, scared of not being good enough for someone like you." The monitors beeped steadily as she continued her vigil. Outside the window, the sun climbed higher, but Tamika barely noticed. She opened her Bible, drawing strength from the worn pages as she had so many times before. "Lord," she prayed softly, "I know I've made mistakes. I let fear drive my choices instead of faith, but please, please spare him. If you give him back to us, I promise I'll stop running. I'll face whatever comes with truth and trust in your plan." Jason's fingers tightened weakly around hers, and she held on, hoping he could feel her presence even in unconsciousness. The morning light filtered through the hospital, blinds casting gentle shadows across his face as the monitors continued their steady rhythm, marking each precious heartbeat. Tamika settled deeper into her chair, still clutching his hand, prepared to wait as long as necessary. In the quiet of the hospital room, surrounded by beeping machines and the whisper of oxygen, she kept her tear-filled vigil, praying for the man who had changed her life in ways she never expected. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor cast harsh shadows as Tamika made her daily trek between Jason's room and the small hospital chapel. 3 days had passed since his collapse, and though his condition had stabilized, he remained unconscious. The doctors spoke of healing taking time, of patience, but every hour that ticked by felt like an eternity. She'd settled into a routine, mornings spent helping the nurses with Jason's basic care, afternoons reading to him from her Bible, or simply talking softly about Grace's latest achievements. The baby stayed with Mrs. Louise, who sent daily photos and updates to keep Tamika's spirits up. On the 4th morning, while adjusting Jason's blanket and freshening the water in the small vase of flowers beside his bed, Tamika heard the sharp click of heels in the hallway. A tall, elegant woman appeared in the doorway, her silver-streaked hair perfectly coiffed, her designer suit immaculate. Even without an introduction, Tamika knew immediately this was Jason's mother. They shared the same strong jawline and determined expression. Mrs. Eleanor Cross's eyes swept the room, taking in every detail before landing on Tamika with glacial disapproval. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees as she stepped inside, her perfectly manicured hand clutching an expensive handbag. "So," Mrs. Cross said, her voice as crisp as autumn frost, "you're the housekeeper." Tamika straightened her shoulders but kept her voice gentle. "Yes, ma'am, I'm Tamika Grant, the one who disappeared with my grandchild." It wasn't a question. Mrs. Cross moved closer to Jason's bed, her face tightening as she looked at her son's pale features. When she turned back to Tamika, her eyes blazed with barely contained fury. "You cost my son everything." The accusation hung heavy in the air between them. Tamika felt its weight, but something in her heart, perhaps the peace she'd found through prayer these past few days, helped her stand firm. "No, ma'am," she replied softly, smoothing Jason's blanket with careful hands. "Grief did that. I just gave him someone to talk to." Mrs. Cross's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly not expecting such a measured response. She opened her mouth as if to argue, then closed it again, looking at her son's face. "The doctors say the stress triggered his heart failure," Mrs. Cross said after a long moment, her voice tight with emotion. "The company scandal, the media circus, all of it?" "Yes, ma'am," Tamika acknowledged. But the weight he was carrying started long before that. Losing his wife, trying to be perfect for everyone, never letting himself grieve properly, that's what really broke his heart. The older woman's shoulders stiffened. "You presume to know my son better than I do?" "No, ma'am. I just listened when he needed to talk." A nurse entered then, checking Jason's vital signs and making notes on his chart. Both women fell silent, watching the routine examination. When they were alone again, Mrs. Cross claimed the chair on the opposite side of Jason's bed, clearly settling in for a long stay. The day passed in tense silence. Tamika continued her quiet ministrations, moistening Jason's lips with a damp cloth, adjusting his pillows, murmuring soft prayers under her breath. Mrs. Cross watched it all with sharp eyes, her expression unreadable. As evening approached, Tamika gathered her worn Bible and shawl. "I'm going to the chapel," she said quietly. "I'll be back in a little while." Mrs. Cross merely nodded, her attention fixed on her son. The hospital chapel was small but peaceful, its stained glass windows casting colored shadows in the dying light. Tamika slipped into her usual pew, the wooden seat familiar after so many hours spent here. She opened her Bible, but the words blurred as tears filled her eyes. "Lord," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I know I've made so many mistakes. Running away that morning was wrong. I let fear win instead of trusting in your plan. Please forgive me for that." She wiped her eyes with trembling fingers. "And Lord, please heal Jason's heart. Not just his physical heart, but his spirit too. He's carried so much pain for so long. If you give him back to us, I promise to help him find his way back to you. I'll be patient and strong, whatever comes next." Unknown to Tamika, Mrs. Cross stood in the chapel doorway, having followed silently from Jason's room. The older woman watched as Tamika continued to pray, her words becoming more personal, more vulnerable. "And Lord, please help me be worthy of his trust this time. Help me be the kind of mother Grace needs, and maybe the kind of woman Jason could learn to love properly, in your time and your way." Tears began to roll down Mrs. Cross's cheeks, silent but steady. She pressed a hand to her mouth, watching as Tamika bowed her head over clasped hands, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. The next morning, Tamika arrived early as usual, carrying a fresh change of clothes and some homemade soup that Mrs. Louise had sent. She found Mrs. Cross already in Jason's room, looking somewhat softer around the edges despite her perfect appearance. As Tamika set down her things, Mrs. Cross cleared her throat. "I heard you in the chapel last night." Tamika stilled, then nodded slowly. "I didn't know you were there." "Exactly." Mrs. Cross's voice had lost its icy edge. "You weren't performing for anyone. You were just being honest." She took a deep breath. "I've spent the night thinking about what you said, about grief being what cost Jason everything, and about how you just listened when he needed to talk." Tamika waited, sensing there was more. "You're not who I thought you were," Mrs. Cross finally said, meeting Tamika's eyes directly. "I had you all wrong. I saw the headlines, heard the gossip, and made assumptions that—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "That were unfair and unkind. Thank you, Mrs. Cross." Tamika replied softly. "That means a lot to me." The older woman stood, smoothing her skirt with practiced hands. "Well then, perhaps we should start over." She extended her hand. "I'm Eleanor Cross, Jason's mother, and I would very much like to meet my granddaughter properly when the time is right." Tamika took her hand, feeling the warmth beneath the formal gesture. "I'm Tamika Grant, and Grace would love to meet her grandmother." As they both settled into their chairs on either side of Jason's bed, the morning sun broke through the clouds outside, filling the room with gentle light. The monitors continued their steady beeping, marking each precious heartbeat as mother and former housekeeper began to bridge the gap between their worlds, united in their love for the man who lay between them. The steady rhythm of hospital monitors filled the room as morning light streamed through the windows. Tamika sat in her usual chair, Grace nestled against her chest, while Mrs. Cross stood nearby, her hand resting lightly on Tamika's shoulder. The gesture, though small, spoke volumes about how far they'd come in just a few days. A slight change in Jason's breathing caught Tamika's attention. His eyelids fluttered, and slowly, so slowly it seemed time itself had paused, they opened. Those familiar grey eyes, the same ones Grace had inherited, focused first on the ceiling, then turned toward the sound of Tamika's quiet gasp. "Jason?" Tamika whispered, tears already streaming down her cheeks. Grace, sensing the shift in energy, cooed softly. His lips moved, forming words that barely carried across the space between them. "I heard you praying." Tamika let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You were listening?" "Every word." He managed, his voice rough from disuse. "In and out, but I heard you." His gaze drifted to his mother, then back to Tamika and Grace. "All of you." Mrs. Cross pressed a tissue into Tamika's free hand before dabbing at her own eyes. "I'll get the nurse," she said, squeezing Tamika's shoulder once more before stepping out. Jason's hand moved slightly on the blanket, reaching toward them. Tamika stood carefully, mindful of Grace, and moved closer so he could touch his daughter's tiny hand. Grace immediately wrapped her fingers around her father's index finger, bringing a weak smile to his face. "My girls," he whispered. The next few hours passed in a blur of medical checks and careful monitoring. By early afternoon, Jason was sitting up slightly, his color improving with each passing hour. Sunlight poured through the window, creating a warm pool of light that seemed to embrace their small family. Mrs. Cross had gone to arrange for some proper food to be brought in, leaving them alone for the first time since Jason's awakening. Grace napped peacefully in the hospital-provided bassinet while Tamika sat on the edge of Jason's bed, their fingers intertwined. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Jason said, his voice stronger now, though still quiet. "Even before this." He gestured vaguely at the hospital room. "About what really matters." Tamika squeezed his hand gently. "And what did you decide?" "That I want to start over. Build something meaningful this time." His eyes held a new kind of determination, not the driven, almost desperate energy of his CEO days, but something steadier, more grounded. Something that isn't about power or greed or impressing the board. "What kind of something?" Jason's thumb traced patterns on her palm as he spoke. "When I lost Sarah, I thought I'd never find purpose again. I threw myself into work because it was easier than facing the emptiness. But then you came along with your quiet strength and your unwavering faith." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "And now, looking at Grace, seeing how you've struggled as a single mother, it's opened my eyes. There are so many people out there walking the same hard roads we have. Grief, loneliness, fear of judgment." Tamika's eyes lit up with understanding. "You want to help them? We could create a foundation," Jason continued, growing more animated. "Something focused on giving single mothers a real chance at a new life. Job training, child care support, housing assistance, whatever they need to break free from the cycle of just surviving." "A fresh start," Tamika murmured, thinking of her own journey from that rainy morning when she'd left his mansion to now. "Exactly. And who better to understand what they need than someone who's lived it?" He squeezed her hand. "You could help run it if you wanted. Your perspective would be invaluable." Tamika felt tears welling up again. Happy tears this time. "You'd trust me with that?" "I trust you with everything," Jason said simply. "My heart, my daughter, my future. Why not this too?" Grace stirred in her bassinet, making little waking up sounds. Tamika moved to pick her up, bringing her back to the bed where Jason could see her. Their daughter blinked sleepily at them both, then broke into a toothless grin that made all three adults laugh softly. Mrs. Cross returned then, carrying a basket that smelled wonderfully of fresh bread and soup. She took in the scene, her son looking more alive than he had in days, Tamika perched on the bed with Grace, all of them smiling, and felt her own heart lift. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, setting the basket down on the side table. "Not at all, Mother," Jason replied. "We were just planning the future." He glanced at Tamika, his eyes soft. "A better one than I ever imagined? Possible." Tamika watched as Mrs. Cross began unpacking the basket, setting out containers of homemade soup and warm rolls that could only have come from Mr. Henson's bakery. The afternoon sun caught the silver in Mrs. Cross's hair, Grace's downy curls, and Jason's tired smile. It wasn't the life any of them had planned, but somehow it felt exactly right. Grace reached out toward Jason, and Tamika carefully settled her against his chest, making sure not to disturb any of the monitoring equipment. Their daughter immediately snuggled close, one tiny hand gripping her father's hospital gown, while the other reached up to pat his face. "Thank you," Jason whispered, looking at Tamika with eyes that held both gratitude and promise. "For not giving up on me, for giving me a reason to build something better." Mrs. Cross quietly arranged 4 place settings on the rolling table, including a small bowl of mashed bananas for Grace. The room filled with warmth that had nothing to do with the sunlight streaming through the windows, the warmth of family, of hope, of new beginnings taking root in fertile soil. As they shared their impromptu meal together, the conversation turned to practical matters: how to structure the foundation, what services to prioritize, which communities to focus on first. But underlying every word was a current of joy, of purpose found and faith rewarded. Grace, secure in her father's arms, began to hum the same hymn Tamika often sang while cleaning, "Amazing Grace." The adults fell silent, listening to the baby's innocent melody. It seemed fitting somehow, this song of redemption and second chances, sung by the child who had brought them all together. The late summer breeze carried the scent of ripening tomatoes through the open windows of the farmhouse. Tamika stood at the kitchen sink, watching Jason and Grace in the garden below. Her husband, the word still felt new and wonderful in her mind, was teaching their daughter how to check if the vegetables were ready for picking. "See this one, sweetheart?" Jason's voice drifted up. "When it's this deep red color, that means it's perfect for Mama's spaghetti sauce." Grace's delighted giggle floated on the air as she reached for another tomato with chubby fingers. At 18 months old, she was more likely to squeeze the fruit than harvest it properly, but Jason's patience never wavered. The peaceful scene before her was a far cry from the corporate chaos they'd left behind. 3 months had passed since Jason's release from the hospital, and each day brought new healing. The farmhouse, with its weathered white paint and wraparound porch, sat on 15 acres just outside the city limits. It was smaller than Jason's mansion, but felt more like home than that cold marble palace ever had. Their new neighbors, mostly farming families who'd lived in the area for generations, had welcomed them without fanfare. Here, Jason wasn't the fallen CEO or the subject of gossip columns. He was just another man working his land, showing up for Sunday service with his family, and bringing fresh vegetables to community potlucks. The phone rang, interrupting Tamika's thoughts. She recognized the number. Harrison Wells, Jason's former vice president. "Mr. Cross's residence," she answered formally. "Mrs. Cross?" Harrison's smooth voice oozed charm. "Is Jason available? The board has been discussing his return. We are prepared to offer him full reinstatement as CEO, plus a considerable bonus." Tamika watched her husband help Grace balance on the garden wall. "He's busy right now, Mr. Wells, but I'll tell him you called. Please remind him that his expertise is wasted on charitable endeavors." After hanging up, Tamika shook her head. It was the 3rd such call this month, but she knew Jason's answer would be the same as always. That evening, as they sat on the porch swing after putting Grace to bed, she told him about the call. Jason just smiled and pulled her closer. "They still don't understand," he said softly. "What we're building with Faith House is worth more than any corporate takeover." Faith House was taking shape in a renovated Victorian mansion downtown. The old building had good bones, as Mrs. Louise said, and even better spirit. Already 4 single mothers and their children had moved into the upstairs apartments while participating in job training programs below. Tamika had hired Sarah, a former waitress from the diner in Maple Hollow, to manage the house's daily operations. Betty from the bakery now ran the commercial kitchen training program. The house hummed with activity, women learning computer skills, children playing in the daycare center, volunteers teaching everything from budgeting to nutrition. "Remember what you told me in the hospital?" Jason asked, his voice thoughtful. "About building something meaningful?" Tamika nodded against his shoulder. "And look at what God had planned. All those months I spent running, feeling ashamed. He was just preparing me for this work." The next morning, they drove into the city for Faith House's weekly community breakfast. The dining room buzzed with conversation and clinking plates. Women who'd once been strangers now sat together like family, sharing stories and supporting each other's dreams. Grace toddled between the tables, collecting hugs and bits of pancake from her many aunties. Jason moved easily through the room, listening to concerns and celebrating victories. Gone was the austere businessman in tailored suits. This Jason wore jeans and rolled-up sleeves, his smile reaching his eyes. Tamika stood in the doorway, overwhelmed with gratitude. A year ago, she'd been cleaning houses and hiding her pregnancy. Now she watched as another young mother checked in, carrying a sleeping baby and looking as lost as Tamika once had. "Welcome to Faith House," Tamika said warmly, embracing the newcomer. "You're safe here." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what to do next." "That's okay," Tamika assured her. "None of us did at first, but we'll figure it out together." As she helped the new arrival settle in, Tamika caught Jason's eye across the room. He was holding Grace and beaming with pride at his wife's natural gift for healing wounded hearts. The life they'd built wasn't featured in financial magazines or measured in stock prices. Instead, it was counted in restored dignity, renewed hope, and the laughter of children who no longer went to bed hungry. Their simple life had become extraordinary, not despite their past struggles, but because of them. Every mistake and misstep had led them here, to this place of purpose and peace. Sunlight streamed through Faith House's stained glass windows as reporters and guests filled the main hall. Camera flashes illuminated the restored Victorian woodwork and fresh paint that had transformed the once neglected building into a beacon of hope. Tamika stood at the podium, her hands steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. The same news outlets that had once branded her the Fat Maid scandal now crowded forward, eager to capture her triumph. She spotted familiar faces from Channel 5 News, the City Tribune, and even national networks. "Faith House isn't just a building," she began, her voice clear and strong. "It's proof that second chances are real." The reporters scribbled furiously, their expressions notably different from the cruel skepticism they'd shown months ago. A journalist who had once written a particularly harsh piece about her raised her hand. "Mrs. Grant, how does it feel to go from housekeeper to becoming a mentor to hundreds?" Tamika smiled graciously. "Every skill I learned as a housekeeper prepared me for this work. God doesn't waste any experience, even the ones that seem humble at the time." The crowd murmured appreciatively. Camera phones captured the moment as Jason stepped forward to join her at the podium. His grey eyes shone with pride as he took the microphone. "A year ago," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I thought my life was over. My company, my reputation, everything I'd built seemed lost." He reached for Tamika's hand. "What I couldn't see then was that God had bigger plans. This began with a mistake we thought would ruin us, but God turned it into grace." Applause erupted through the hall. In the front row, Mrs. Louise dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, beaming at the couple she'd supported through their darkest days. The moment grew even more precious when little Grace, wearing a tiny yellow dress, broke free from Mrs. Louise's gentle hold. She toddled across the stage toward Jason, her arms raised. "Daddy!" she called out clearly for the first time. The room fell silent. Jason scooped her up, tears streaming down his face unashamedly. Tamika couldn't hold back her own tears as she watched her daughter snuggle into her father's arms. Mrs. Louise's knowing smile caught Tamika's eye. That wise woman had told her months ago to trust God's plan, even when it seemed impossible. Now, watching reporters capture this moment of pure joy, Tamika's heart overflowed with gratitude. The headlines the next day would read, "From Scandal to Sanctuary, How Love Transformed Lives at Faith House." But for Tamika, the real story wasn't in the papers, It was written in the tears of joy streaming down her cheeks as she stood with her family, surrounded by the community that had become their extended family. Golden morning light filtered through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the worn wooden pews of First Baptist Church. Tamika sat between Jason and little Grace, their shoulders touching as the congregation sang "Amazing Grace." 6 months had passed since Faith House opened its doors, and each Sunday brought a new sense of peace. Grace, now almost 2 years old, whispered along with the hymn in her own special way. Her dark curls caught the light as she swayed, one tiny hand clutching her father's sleeve, the other holding her mother's fingers. Jason's deep voice carried the bass notes, while Tamika harmonized softly, their voices blending like they'd sung together for years. After the final prayer, they joined the steady stream of people flowing out into the bright autumn morning. The air held that perfect crispness that made everything feel fresh and new. Without discussion, their feet carried them toward Memorial Park, the same park where they'd reunited all those months ago. Grace skipped between them, her patent leather shoes clicking against the sidewalk. She'd insisted on wearing her favorite yellow dress, the one that matched the falling maple leaves. Her laughter echoed as she pointed at squirrels darting across their path. They passed the bench where Jason had first held his daughter. Now it bore a small plaque dedicating the park as a partner location for Faith House activities. Beyond the trees, they could see the Victorian building's roof, its banner fluttering in the breeze. The sounds of children playing and women chatting drifted across the grass. Sunday afternoon programs were in full swing. Jason squeezed Tamika's hand, drawing her close as they walked. His touch was warm and sure, so different from the uncertain man who'd nearly lost everything. The lines around his eyes had softened, replaced by laugh lines that appeared whenever Grace did something amusing, which was often. They paused beneath a massive oak tree, watching their daughter chase leaves in the grass. Jason turned to Tamika, his grey eyes full of tenderness. "You know something?" he said softly, kissing her forehead. "You didn't ruin my life, Tamika. You gave it back to me." Tamika's heart swelled as she leaned into his embrace. Through the trees, she could see women from Faith House gathering for their afternoon support group. Some faces she recognized from her own struggling days in Maple Hollow. Others were new, each carrying their own story of hope and healing. Grace's delighted squeals drew their attention as she ran across the grass, her arms spread wide like wings. Tamika watched her daughter's joy, remembering all the prayers whispered in darkness, all the moments of doubt and fear that had led to this perfect morning. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, her words carrying on the gentle breeze. "Thank you for showing me that redemption doesn't come all at once. It comes in every small act of courage, every step toward home." Her daughter's laughter, Jason's steady presence, and the distant sounds of Faith House's community blended into a symphony of grace, proof that sometimes the longest roads lead exactly where they're meant to. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.